Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Melbourne Traditionalist podcast, episode 39. My name's Mark Moncrief, and I run Upon Hope. And today I want to continue talking about China. Now, last week I talked about China between 1949, the foundation of the People's Republic of China, and 1976, the end of the Cultural Revolution. This week I want to talk about China from the 1970s and the West's relationship with China. And then we'll finish up with talking about the current crisis, the COVID-19 saga, and what the future holds. So just to go back over last week, just to refresh people's memories, the People's Republic of China was set up in 1949, and the Communist Party was made up of two factions: the Reds, who believed in communism, and the experts, who believed in basically them being the experts, them knowing things that other people didn't, and using facts and figures. That doesn't mean they weren't communists. It just means that they didn't just regard communism as the only answer. And between 1949 and 1976, it was a constant power play between the Reds and the experts to gain control and to force their vision of the future on China. And in 1976, the Cultural Revolution ends, and the Reds, who had been in control during the Cultural Revolution, they lost that control. So from now on, we're talking about the experts being in control of China. Now, before we talk about China, to understand why things progressed as they did, we have to understand containment. Now, containment was the strategy put in place by the United States during the Cold War, put in place in 1947, and it remained in place until the early 90s when the Cold War ended. And basically what it said was that communism had to be treated as if it was a contagious disease. It had to be contained, or in English, quarantined. And basically you would stop it from spreading, you would stop its interaction with people who were not affected by the disease. So that's a very interesting analogy to use communism and to equate it to disease. And in the late 1940s, there was a lot of controversy within the United States government about exactly what containment should mean. And eventually the broadest definition of containment was that communism had to be contained everywhere around the world, and it wasn't simply a military containment, it wasn't simply a political containment, it was also a cultural containment and an economic containment. And what interests us here is the economic component, because high technology was restricted, and in fact all trade with the communist world was restricted. It wasn't that it didn't take place, it was that it was kept under limits, and it was always under surveillance, it was always being kept track of, and they just didn't want it to become a major feature of the West's economy. Sure, the West could trade with each other, and they could trade with what came to be called the non-aligned states, but their trade with the communist countries should be as limited as possible. But at the same time, they did want some trade because it gave them access to the communist world that they couldn't have had otherwise. In 1945, the British Labour government actually had an exchange of technology with the Soviet Union. They wanted a good relationship with the Soviets at the end of World War II and going into the post-war era. And they actually sent them jet engines. And the Soviets didn't have any jet aircraft. They did after that. And in fact, the MiG-15, which would fight against the West in the Korean War was using jet engines developed from the jet engine sent to the Soviet Union. The West didn't want a repeat of that. So any type of high technology was restricted, very much restricted. Now, that was the same with China, as it was with the Soviet Union. But when Nixon decided to try and separate the Soviets and the Chinese, in reality, they were already separated, they were already hostile to each other. But now Nixon tried to bring them onto the West side. And the idea was always that they would be able to subvert China and make it a Western country. There was always that conceit in the background. And it was decided that gradually, not at first, it was very, very slowly, but gradually the idea was that advanced technology could be given to China, but it couldn't be given to the Soviets. And at the end of the Cold War, that type of technology exchange would increase. Now, the big important figure in China after the Cultural Revolution is Deng Xiaoping. Now, Deng Xiaoping was born in 1904, so by the time he came to power, he was in his 70s. He'd been a member of the Communist Party since the early, I think 1921 he joined the Communist Party, so he joined very young, very early, was in the Long March, was a senior commander in the Civil War, and he was also involved in economics in the 1950s. And while he agreed with Mao on politics, he disagreed with him on economics. And he was in and out of high office throughout the 50s, throughout the 60s, and throughout the 70s. And in the Cultural Revolution, he was denounced. And here's this, effectively a cabinet minister, and he was sent to run but to work in a tractor factory. And for 5 years, he worked in a tractor factory as a tyre fitter. And he's in his late 60s at that point. And then because he was the only senior commander of the Civil War left, he was basically recalled to office in 1974. And when Mao died and then the Gang of Four were deposed, he was basically the last senior figure from the revolution who was still alive. And people knew that he had a different attitude to Mao. I think that was very, very important. And his economics was really based on something that he said in 1961. It's quite famous. No matter if it is a white cat or a black cat, as long as it can catch mice, it's a good cat. And that's very much his attitude. He's very much a practical man. But he had a very long-term vision. And when the Cultural Revolution ended, he, unlike Mao, began to travel abroad. And one of the places he went to was Singapore. And he was very impressed by Singapore. And he actually took that as his model. So we have this city-state, and he wants to expand that to include the most populous country on earth. And he talked with Lee Kuan Yew, who was the Prime Minister of Singapore. And he actually sent about 22,000 advisors to Singapore. Well, sorry, not advisors, basically to learn about how Singapore had done things and to replicate that in China. And then one of the things that Lee Kuan Yew suggested was stop trying to spread Chinese communism. And he actually did. That was a very big movement. But one thing that people who have looked at Deng Xiaoping have also said is that none of the reforms were actually his. Very few were his ideas. Most of them came from other people. And he simply endorsed them and made them work, gave them the authority to work. And one of those things was what was called the four modernizations: economy, agriculture, scientific and technological development, and national defence. And during the Cultural Revolution, he'd been accused of being a capitalist roader, someone who was on the road to capitalism. And in fact, he did justify his combining of the two. And this is a quote: "Planning and market forces are not the essential difference between socialism and capitalism. A planned economy is not the definition of socialism, because there is planning under capitalism. The market economy happens under socialism too. Planning and market forces are both ways of controlling economic activity." Now, he had a very fundamental difference with Mao, not simply on politics, but on economics. Mao wanted China to be self-sufficient, what's called autarky, and which means that basically most of the economic activity, or all of it, comes from within the country. And what Xiaoping wanted was, he wanted China to develop. He wanted China to undergo an industrial revolution. Now, between the formation of the People's Liberation of China in 1949 and today, 2020, China has increased, its economy has increased by about 270 times. So if you can think that for every factory in China in 1949, there's now 270. Now, that's not an exact correlation, but it gives you a mental framework to understand just how much China's economy has changed. And nearly all of that, like much more than 90%, has happened since 1980. And that economic growth took place because of that liberalisation, that ability to free up the economy. Instead of everything being controlled by the central government, they actually began to allow more business opportunities. So in the late 1970s and early 1980s, they began the decollectivization of agriculture. So the communes that I talked about last week, they were done away with, and slowly people were allowed to acquire their own land again. There was the opening up of the country to foreign investment. Before about 1977, nobody could invest in China. It just simply couldn't be done. And from that time, it began to happen. And the other thing was that while existing industry remained controlled by the government, new industry could be built and it could operate as a private business, something that absolutely wasn't available before that time. And then in the late 1980s and 1990s, they began to privatise even the state-owned industries, and to either sell them or to contract them out to private business. They also lifted things like price controls. They began to limit tariffs, and they began to get rid of more regulations to allow more trading to take place. But there were still state monopolies such as banking and petroleum and things like that. So it wasn't a total free economy, but it was much freer than it had been. So it went from basically 100% government controlled to about 30% in about 25 years. And as the economy began to be liberalised, many people in China thought that politics and society should also be liberalised. And people began to talk of a fifth modernisation. And that fifth modernisation was democracy. That instead of the Communist Party ruling, there should be a multi-party democracy, just like in the West. Well, the Communist Party wasn't that keen on that idea. And that idea that the pro-democracy movement would lead to Tiananmen Square in 1989. Now, of course, in 1989 as Tiananmen Square is happening, there's a lot of liberalisation going on in the rest of the communist world, in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And of course, the Berlin Wall falls in 1989, and every country in Eastern Europe abandons communism in 1989 and 1990. And then in 1991, the Soviet Union collapses and it abandons communism. So there's a lot of pressure in China for this to also happen, but that does not happen. Instead, there's a massive crackdown, and that idea is put to rest. It's not something that the Communist Party is interested in at all. And that's why the recent protests in Hong Kong have been such a problem and such a worry for the Communist Party, is that they see that this could be the beginning of a new and bigger pro-democracy movement. I don't think that will happen, because I think most people in China look down on the Hong Kongese, and the Hong Kongese look down on the rest of the Chinese people. There's, while ethnically they're the same people, their history is so diverse that they're not the same people anymore. But the West loved what was happening in China. The West saw it as proof of what they themselves believed, of this liberal vision of the future, because you start with liberalising economics, allowing money and workers and capital and goods to be free, and that's what China was doing, probably more than most places at some points. And then that leads to liberal politics, and then liberal politics leads to personal liberation, to the creation of the autonomous individual, which is the high point of liberalism, the end goal. So everything that's happening in China seems to head towards that, and Tiananmen Square is a big shock. But after a few years, after about 1992, the economic liberalisation continues, but politically there is no liberalisation, and that becomes the compromise that is reached between the Communist Party and the Chinese people. You can be rich, but you can't be free. And most people are actually quite poor. So the idea of actually having money is a good compromise. And people know what it is to be poor, but unless you've been free, well, what are you missing? So it wasn't that big an issue for most people. Now, I'd like to take a step back and talk about the first and second ages of globalization. We are in the second age of globalization. Maybe it's coming to an end. Some people have said it is. Other people say it's not. But the first age of globalization is basically 1840 to 1914. And the start is a little bit elastic. You can argue for before, you can argue for after. But surprisingly, the end point is very specific. It's November 1914, where Britain, the greatest liberal power of the first age of globalization, the powerhouse of globalization at that time, is at war with Germany, and it decides that it doesn't want its money to be spent in South America or wherever. It wants its money to be spent by the government to fight the war. So it effectively ends the first age of globalization. Bang, just like that. But just like now, it basically meant people moving all over the world. It meant capital and goods moving all over the world, and it being as free as possible. And in fact, the First Opium War wasn't really about opium. Opium was the physical good, but really what the war was about was free trade. And China said, hey, we don't want to trade with you. And Britain and France, who are often forgotten, were also in the war. They said, no, you have to trade with us. And before that, China would only trade, the only thing that it wanted was opium. And the only thing that it would accept for trade goods was silver, not gold, not precious jewels, not money, just silver. And obviously that created a lot of problems, and they were the reason that the war was fought. It wasn't specifically to make China accept opium, which actually did happen, but it was really to open China up to Western trade. And that began the century of humiliation, as the Chinese call it, that ultimately ended with the formation of the People's Republic of China. But as China liberalised, we were entering the second age of globalisation. And China was a big part of that. But actually, people in the West, businessmen, political theorists, economists, politicians, they began to see China as a way of recreating that age of globalisation, what the left calls neoliberalism, and it's probably a good name for it, new liberalism. And it is that revival of what had gone before. And basically they wanted, again, a world where people could move around freely, where goods could move around freely, where capital, money, can move around freely, and that we can get rid of barriers to that. Tariffs, and, well, now they talk about getting rid of borders. That is all part of liberalism's goal, to get rid of all those barriers and allow people to move and everything else to move freely. But what forced that? I explained why the first age of globalisation ended, but why did they want to revive it? Well, there were three main reasons. The first were unions, the second were high wages, and the third was high regulations. So let's look at those three. So first of all, we have unions. Well, unions exist because capitalists are morons. If capitalists were smart, they'd look after their workers, because it would mean that there'd be less problems. Now, occasionally there are genuine problems. Oh, I thought you wanted this and you actually want that. So that's a genuine issue. But sometimes, and this is a lot more common than we would all like to think, it's because people are just being selfish. They're just being bastards. They're looking after their interests at other people's expense. And that's something as traditionalists that we are completely against. We want employers and employees to be on the same side. But we don't exist in a traditionalist society. We live in a liberal society. And in liberalism, they believe in conflict. So the unions have a legitimate place there. They represent the workers on the one hand against the employers. And as the unions gained more and more power, they abused that power. They began to demand more and more. And in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, you'll see these huge strikes, and they're constantly happening. It's truly amazing now, where that's a very rare occurrence. But back then it wasn't rare. It was it was something that happened every day. Somewhere, someone was on strike in the country. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Australia or America or Canada or the United Kingdom or wherever. This was a big, big problem. And it obviously led to a lot of costs, monetary costs and societal costs. Now, one of the things that unions helped create was a high wage environment where people got paid good wages for the jobs that they provided. But the problem with the unions was that they didn't care about the viability of the company. Basically, the economy is X amount wealthy, so workers have to be paid X amount of money. Well, what about if the company is not X amount wealthy, but Y amount wealthy? It's not quite as wealthy as the other companies around it. Well, that's too bad. They still have to pay the X price, not the Y price. So workers can lose their jobs because the unions insist, and in fact, in that time, the governments insisted that everyone got paid exactly the same high wages. That obviously creates a lot of issues, financial problems, revenue problems, and also it creates higher prices. When I was a kid, I remember I was watching the news. The news had just come on. It was the very first story on the news, and there was a female reporter, and she says, "Oh, wonderful news! Everyone's going to get a pay increase." And my mother had walked into the room, and she said, "Oh, bloody typical! And now all the prices will go up." And I was like, "What? How can that be? How can it be? Everyone's going to get more money." But of course, she's right. All those wages have to be paid from somewhere. And within a month or two, all the goods went up. So it's a constant race to try and get in front. So high wages are actually a little bit of a trap. But then the third is high regulations. Now, I remember, even going back 20 years ago, although even 20 years ago it was rare, today I haven't seen a building like this in a long, long time, but in the 70s and 80s it was very common to see old buildings, that'd be 50 or 100 years old, and it looked like they had never been cleaned in that entire time. They were just covered in grime, and they had windows, but you couldn't see into them, and no one could see out of them. And that was because we were an industrial society. And so, soot and other pollutants were pumped into the air, and they came back to Earth, and they rested on the buildings and so forth. And because they were commercial buildings, it didn't matter how they looked. It mattered what they could do. So they weren't cleaned up. And it led to people had a very bad attitude. I think it led to a lot of these ideas about destroying old buildings and replacing them with new, clean, efficient buildings. And that word clean is used a lot when you're talking about modern architecture. And I think a lot of the reason is because of the older buildings simply weren't clean. Now you go around and those exact same buildings look fantastic. They look like $1 million. They're probably worth $1 million because they've just been cleaned. But of course it didn't make sense to clean a building when it's just going to get really dirty again really quickly. And one of the reasons is because most of our industry has either been dismantled or sent to China. So we actually live in a much cleaner environment. But my point about high regulations is also that the environment and other regulations are one of these hidden costs. We say, you can't pollute to this level. Well, that has a cost, a monetary cost. So businesses are actually looking to, well, how can we get rid of this cost? But what also happens is, in liberalism, they believe in incrementalism. So just because something is happening now, this is just the first step. That in 5 years' time, there'll be stricter regulations. And in another 5 years, they'll be even stricter, and so on and so forth. It'll just get worse and worse and worse. All of these things encouraged companies to send their business to China. And what that gave us was it gave us permanent unemployment. What's incredible is that between 1945 and 1975, roughly, unemployment in the West was seasonal. In Australia, if you were unemployed for more than 3 months in that period, you were counted as long-term unemployed. Well, now that's ridiculous. Now it's 12 months, and it has been since the 1970s, because in the 1970s we began to get permanent unemployment. But on the plus side, everything was cheaper because all of those labour costs were gone. There weren't unions in China. They weren't getting paid high wages. Their environment, they didn't care, and we didn't care. So everything was cheaper. And as we all know, everything that cheaper came at a cost. You go to use something and it breaks straight away, or it breaks after 3 weeks, and then you have to go back and buy it, which in fact has an environmental cost. But monetarily, you're like, well, what does it matter? They're really cheap. And a lot of people do look at it like that. Today, in April 2020, we have the COVID-19 lockdown. Now, this, if it had been 100 or 50 years ago, would be called Wuhan flu, most likely. And it has exposed 2 massive problems that people on our side have been talking about for a long, long time. And the first is the supply chain. Why have we outsourced so much of our manufacturing to a country far, far away? Even in just a small problem like the flu, and I'm one of those people who thinks it is just the flu, then it shut down international trade. So things that we need on a day-to-day basis, we can't get. Things that are needed by the medical profession are in short supply because they come from China. This is something that we said right from the start was a problem, and everybody poo-pooed us. Well, now we've been proven right, and hopefully people will start to take notice of that. But the second big issue is, did China lie? How many people actually got sick in China? When did they get sick? And how many of those people died? Because the figures from China are actually really low. I think 3,400 people died. That's the official figures from China. But the West has not reacted as if 3,400 people died, because there are more than 1 billion people in China. 3,400 people, that's a tragedy for them. It's a tragedy for their families and friends. But in a world, it's not very much at all. In fact, it's not very much in China. But that's not how the governments in the West reacted. They either reacted with panic, or they don't trust China at all, or they panicked and they don't trust China. All of that means that we're looking at a new relationship developing between the West and China. That's going to be very interesting. It's going to be hard to look at China in the same way. And here it has been exposed to everybody. Not simply people on the right, but normies, people on the left, who actually on this issue probably agree with us more than we think, and mainstream politicians who have started to talk about this problem. Well, it's going to get very interesting because our relationship cannot be the same. Well, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. And if you'd like to support my work, you can go down to Subscribestar, which is in the description box below. And I hope everyone has a good week, and I will speak to you again next week. Bye-bye.